Hi everyone, welcome to Aurora Public Library's program on the colors of the women's suffrage movement. Some of you may be looking at this and saying, there's supposed to be a craft, Megan, where's the craft? And there will be, but before we get into the detailed steps for the craft, I'm going to go over the symbolism of some of the colors used by the women's suffrage movement, just so you have more context for what you're looking at as we make the craft and if you do your own historical research afterwards. So the women's suffrage movement here in the United States drew a lot of inspiration from the women's suffrage movement in the United Kingdom, which was running basically concurrently. Women over the age of 30 got the right to vote in the UK in 1918, so slightly before women over the age of 30 in the US. But they didn't lower the voting age for women to 21, which was the same as it was for men, until 1928, which was several years after the 19th Amendment had been passed in the United States. In the UK, suffragists adopted three primary colors for their signage and their educational information. They used purple to represent royalty and dignity, not necessarily to suggest that they themselves were royalty, but merely to represent sort of a faithfulness to the country that was not contradicted by women's suffrage, and to imbue themselves with the sort of dignity that voting would politically confer upon them. The color green represented hope and new beginnings, the season of spring, kind of this rebirth of starting over. And the color white represented purity and femininity. What they meant by this really was that women wanted the vote not because they wanted to be men or be like men, but because women themselves were intrinsically worthy of having the vote and participating in the political process in this way. A lot of the criticism of suffragists at the time tried to depict them as being very masculine, as wanting to like take over the household and sort of like emasculate their husbands. And so the purpose of the color white was to reconnect them to historical depictions of femininity. It was a color that was already associated with women, and to separate themselves from men and affirm their own dignity as women. So you'll see many pictures, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, of suffragists from this era wearing white dresses. It was also common for people to incorporate these colors into their clothing or into jewelry, which is part of what inspired this craft. It became a way to, if you wore a little brooch or a pin on your hat or something like that, to kind of signal to other people your support for women's suffrage. The picture on the right is a 1909 portrait of Christabel Pankhurst. She was a noted suffragist in the UK, daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. This was painted by Edith Wright, and like I said, exhibited in 1909. It currently hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in the UK. But you can see that the artist chose to depict her wearing a sash with the colors of women's suffrage. And sashes of this kind are a common historical artifact from the era. In the United States, many of the women who were active in the national suffrage campaign in the years leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment were women who had been overseas to the UK. They had been part of Emmeline Pankhurst's movement, and they had seen how women in the UK had organized for women's suffrage. And they adopted many of those same tactics and some of the same color symbolism into the movement in the United States. In particular, the National Woman's Party adopted the colors of purple, white, and gold. The National Women's Party was heavily invested in pushing for a constitutional amendment to make women's suffrage legal throughout the entire United States. The suffrage movement in the United States definitely predates the National Women's Party, but up until that time, a lot of the focus had been on getting each state individually to grant women the right to vote. In the 19th century, many states were joining the Union, and so many of them confronted this question of women's suffrage as they were becoming a state. You know, would they allow women to vote in their new state? You'll notice that they kind of abandoned the color green in favor of this golden yellow color. Like I said, a lot of the campaigns for women's suffrage were focused on individual states. And in 1867, there had been a very contentious and influential suffrage campaign in the state of Kansas that used the sunflower as a symbol of women's suffrage. The sunflower at the time was a well-known symbol for the state of Kansas. So much like women in the UK had used the royal color purple to show their allegiance to their country, the suffragettes in Kansas had adopted the sunflower to show, you know, hey, we're not opposed to Kansas. You know, we're not the enemies of Kansas. We love Kansas and we want to participate in the political process. This color yellow was also said to represent light and life. There was a women's suffrage pamphlet that described this color as representing the torch that guides our purpose. The color white, just like in the UK, represented femininity and purity. And the color purple, because the US does not have a monarchy and was in fact a country founded in opposition to the British monarchy, the color purple no longer really represented royalty, but represented being loyal to the cause instead. It was a dignified color. It represented women's willingness to devote themselves entirely to this cause. I did put together a little slide with some of my sources that I will make available with this post on Aurora Public Library's social media. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is mcavitt, C-A-V-I-T-T, @aurorapubliclibrary.org. So now that you have a little bit of historical context for what inspired this craft, let's move on to the craft itself. The craft that we're going to make today is rosettes, inspired by the suffragettes who frequently wore suffragette colors as brooches, jewelry, and other kind of flower-like objects. What you'll need for this craft is some colorful paper or fabric, some craft glue, a pair of scissors, a ruler, and some heavy cardstock or thin cardboard like this. I've made a couple of examples here. The fun part about this craft is that you can play with it and do all sorts of different textures and colors and finished projects. You can glue magnets or clips or pins to the back and turn these into magnets, hair clips, bag pins, things of that nature. This one that I've made here, I did in the colors of the UK suffragettes, mostly because I had this nice dark green paper that I really wanted to play with. So as you can see, you can have them with tails, without. You can do different types of paper folding on the different layers to get different effects. It's just a really fun craft to play around with and something that you can easily do in your own home with what you've got on hand. The first thing you'll need to do is take the cardstock or thin cardboard and cut out backing for your rosette. The size does not hugely matter. It should be slightly smaller than you want the finished product to be.
Next, you will cut out a strip of paper. You'll want it to be half the diameter wide and 3 or 4 times as long. So for example, with this paper, I'm hoping to get a base for my rosette, sort of like this red layer here, that is about 2 inches in diameter. So I've cut a 1 inch wide strip that's about 8 inches long. That way, that should give us the size, the 2 inch diameter size that we want. Once you've got your strip, you're gonna take it and fold over just a tiny piece of the top, like so. Then you're gonna flip it over, fold again, like so. Then you're gonna flip it back over, fold again, and we'll continue this way to get sort of this nice accordion folded strip of paper. So at this point, you should have your backing, you should have your base. The base part will kind of slowly get crunched into a circle. Some people like to attach the 2 ends together by standing it up like this, and then we'll sort of squish down the middle to kind of flatten it out. Other people find it easier to put it flat from the beginning and form it into kind of a circular pattern, although as you can see, it will fight you if you try to do that. But eventually you should end up with this nice circular rosette form. You'll glue that with your craft glue onto the backing. If you want to add a tail, the stage, once you've got your initial rosette piece and the backing, that's the stage where you'll need to think about the tail. You can either attach the tail to the backing underneath the first layer, like this one here, or you can do it on top of the first layer, like with this example that I've made. I opted to cut some paper to make it, give it kind of a flow like a ribbon, and glue it onto the top of the first layer. The second layer is where you can really have a lot of fun in my experience. As you've seen, I did sort of a petal shape with some folded paper with this one. This one just has a second kind of accordion folded piece of paper. You don't even have to use paper. You can switch to fabric for this layer, or you can use other craft objects around your house. To continue with this one in our nice US National Women's Party colors, I couldn't quite decide if I wanted to do a flower shape, since flowers were associated with suffragettes, especially sunflowers and roses, or if I wanted to do kind of a star shape, which, you know, has the great symbolism of kind of reaching for something far beyond your initial grasp. So I did a little bit of both. I made this kind of 2-layer paper object. So I'll attach just a little bit of glue to the back and glue that on there. And then for the very center, I've made a very tiny little piece of accordion paper that when it's this small, it almost ends up looking like a little flower. We'll attach that with some glue to the middle, and we'll end up with something that looks kind of like this. If you're doing this sort of thing with fabric, obviously the fabric won't hold an accordion fold the way the paper will. So what you'll need to do instead is kind of fold it over at the bottom, leaving the top spread out, and then place a little stitch right where my thumb is to hold it in place. And you'll continue around the fabric in a circular pattern to get that nice kind of fluffy flower-like rosette base. Well, I hope you all enjoyed doing this craft with me and learning a little bit about the color symbolism you'll see in historical materials related to the women's suffrage movement. The 19th Amendment, which gave women in the United States the constitutional right to vote, is celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2020. If you're interested in more historical content, watch our social media pages. Starting on August 17th, we'll be premiering Windy City Road Warriors video, Games Not Played, Chicago's failed Olympic bids. So you'll learn all about the city of Chicago's history with the Olympics and the narrow misses that we've had hosting the Olympics. Also, don't forget that the library is now open for browsing. If you go to our website, aurorapubliclibrary.org, you can make a browse and go appointment to come into any of our 3 branches for an hour at a time, pick out your own materials, and see the library staff like me. I look forward to seeing you.